Welcome back to the wonderful world of Genealogy, a Newcastle Family History Society podcast. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. This series had been put on hold for a short time due to the sudden and very sad passing of co-author and presenter Marie Schilling. In their meticulous style, Marie and her husband Ken had prepared well in advance the final 2 episodes in this series, and we're sure that Marie would want them to go to air. Ken is joined today by member Margaret Ashford as they offer some suggestions as to how you can put some flesh on the bones to enhance your family's story.
How many people on your family tree sit there with just their name and a random date or two to represent their life story? Everyone who came before us has lived a life of some sort, and it is the details of these lives which puts flesh on the bones. In carrying out your family history research, it will soon become evident that names and dates are just a starting point, and finding the background of an ancestor's life can add so much more to the story. As you progress, you will discover the inseparable link between genealogy and social history. Many times we have heard, "There is nothing of interest in my family. They were just ordinary people leading ordinary lives." This may be the case at first glance, but look a little deeper. What was happening in your ancestors' country at the time when they lived, and did it impact on your family? The Great Depression of the 1930s and celebrations at the end of World War II are just 2 examples in Australia of events which would have had some effect on everyone. Was any member of your family in Newcastle in 1867 when gas lighting was turned on for the first time, or in Sydney in 1932 to see the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge? Has the weather played a role in your family's story through floods, fire, droughts, or storms? Remember Maitland 1955, or more recently in 2007, the Pashabalka storm as it became known. Like our recent COVID experience, influenza epidemics in 1826, 1851, 1918 and 1919 all took their toll, while the outbreak of poliomyelitis in the 1930s led later to mass inoculation with a Salk vaccine. Almost my whole school population lined up for their dose, no one prepared to show fear in front of their peers. Political decisions certainly have made a difference for many families, outstanding examples being the introduction of an 8-hour working day and the decisions to send Australia to war on several occasions. There are many more areas you might like to investigate. You don't have to be a student of history to achieve the aim of fleshing out your ancestors' life. Information is just a click away via your computer search engine when you ask the question, "What was happening in?" and insert the appropriate year and place.
However, in finding out what was happening in your ancestor's town, be sure to gather only information which would have affected him or her. In a previous podcast in this series, George Lonsdale, convict and innkeeper, was used to illustrate some points, and he will now be used again. George was born close to London, and during his time in London, King George III went mad, and his son, also George, made regent. With the death in 1820 of King George, the Prince Regent became King George IV. In the 1830s, Regent's Canal opened, and the old Parliament houses burned down. Victoria came to the throne, and penny postage was introduced. All quite interesting happenings, but perhaps George Lonsdale could not have cared less about any of those events, and his life went on as usual. He may not even have known about the events. On the other hand, with his father's occupation being that of a sugar baker, the prolonged shortage of sugar at that time would most definitely have had an impact on the Lonsdale family. So, in finding historical happenings, be selective, only choosing those items which would have a direct influence on an ancestor.
Newspapers are a wonderful resource for finding events which might have influenced your ancestors' thinking. Instead of a scattergun approach, select a particular date such as that of your grandparents' marriage, or the birth of your favourite uncle, and search the paper of that date and place. Is there a headline on the front page? Are there any photographs included? If so, they might reveal information about transport, buildings, and even clothing styles of the times. The entertainment section of the paper could carry an advertisement for a recently released movie or notice of a forthcoming dance complete with the venue, entrance costs, and the name of the dance band. Don't overlook the general advertisement section. That is where you might find items for sale and their costs, such as groceries, poultry, furniture, and the latest medical remedies for what ails you. Parcels of newly opened land might be advertised, and it often comes as quite a surprise to find the suburb where you grew up was covered in bushland just a short time ago. As children, your parents probably went exploring in the bush, built cubby houses and picked wildflowers, where now there are roads, houses, and maybe a shopping centre or school. Did your parents buy a block of land in a newly developed subdivision to build their first home? A wonderful collection of subdivision maps is held at Newcastle Region Library and is well worth searching out. By looking at each section of a newspaper, you will build up a picture of life as your ancestor experienced it. If you are hoping to find what life was like in Britain, there is a site for British newspapers dating back over 300 years at www.britishnewspaperarchive.co.uk, which has a free-to-view option. Great for a rainy day's research.
If you have some photographs of your ancestors, look closely at the images for details. Is a gentleman wearing some sort of uniform? Has he served his country in times of war, or is he shown wearing his Salvation Army uniform, or perhaps wearing his Masonic regalia? The evidence you are seeking may not be as obvious as a uniform, but might be just a small badge on his lapel, indicating membership of a sporting club or political party. The young woman whose portrait you are holding is wearing a corsage. Could this be marking a significant birthday or even an engagement? Another image is of a happy couple with the male seated and the female standing close by with her left hand resting on his shoulder in such a way as to display a new wedding ring. The last image you hold is of an elderly woman dressed in black with a long string of jet beads around her neck. Special mourning jewellery, such as a brooch containing a lock of a loved one's hair or a string of jet beads, is a sure sign that the person is in mourning for the recent loss of someone close to them. Little details can sometimes open up a new aspect of your ancestor's life.
Do you have a serviceman in your family? Then you are indeed in luck. Australia, New Zealand and Canada have each made digitised World War I service records freely available to researchers on their respective National Archives websites. Australia has also digitised many World War II records. The Australian National Archives website is www.naa.gov.au. If you find a service record for your soldier, go through every page of the record, noting all events in date order, as well as the names of transport vessels, camps and hospitals. Further research on these can be carried out later. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra holds detailed information on Australian infantry, the light horse, artillery, medical and hospital units. There are also outlines of battalions and links to war diaries, all to be found at www.awm.gov.au. The Australian War Memorial also holds Red Cross files consisting of prisoner of war records and wounded or missing inquiries. Some newspapers, such as the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate, carried copies of letters sent home from men serving overseas and which their family had given permission for the paper to publish. There is nothing like these letters for gaining an insight into conditions experienced by our men and women on the front line. Charles Bean's Official History of World War I is a must-read for anyone wanting to add information to the story of a serving World War I ancestor. Visit your local library to find a copy of his books or search online.
If you are seeking someone involved in public service, there are many indexes you would find online. Taking one example, the New South Wales Police Gazettes 1854 to 1930 contain information on police promotions and new appointments, as well as criminals and the crimes they committed, missing persons and deserters, and lists of stolen goods. Included in the Gazette dated Wednesday, 29 January 1868, is one such item. Lost or stolen on the 23rd instant from the person of Archibald Campbell, 2nd Officer, Royal Mail Steamer Avoca, whilst drunk and asleep in Cumberland Street, 1 gold shirt stud, part of the chanter of a set of Highland pipes mounted with ebony and ivory, and 1 brown silk umbrella, value 30 shillings, identifiable.
Another example from public service records held at the New South Wales State Archives in their school files helped fill out my family story. I opened the file for the Cayuga School near Muswellbrook, where I knew my ancestor was on the school board. Imagine my surprise when I began reading the first document in the bundle, a letter from the teacher of some 6 foolscap pages detailing a falling out between the teacher and the board. Other documents added to the story, and I came away from that visit to State Archives with a greater knowledge of my ancestor than I had reckoned on. No matter if your ancestor lived on a remote property, a small town, or a bustling city, they were part of a community. Their friends, neighbours, or workmates form what we might call their social network. These are the people we find living next door to them on a census return, acting as witnesses at their weddings or signing their names at the foot of their wills. One good way of setting your ancestors' life in the context of their local community is to use a map. Once you have ascertained where your ancestor lived, search for a map of that area. There are many different types of maps: estate maps for large rural properties, town or city maps, and ordnance survey maps. An excellent site to search if you are looking for a place in the United Kingdom, for example, is the National Library of Scotland's site at maps.nls.uk. Once you have a map of the area pertaining to your ancestor, plot their residence at the time of their birth, marriage, and death. You will find that many families did not move very far in their lifetime, while some others moved regularly, giving you the need for more than one map. Add to the map the places relevant to a spouse, and that probably brings up the question of, how did they meet? If they live near a town big enough to have a regular market, farmers might go there to sell their goods, people could seek employment there, and perhaps even meet a future spouse there. Plot that marketplace on your map if appropriate. The other 2 places to look for are a church and a pub. You need to find the locations for these establishments, as they are the places for socialising. How far were they from your ancestors' home, and how did they get there? Did they walk, ride a horse, or even travel by boat? Maybe highlight any route on your map that your ancestor may have regularly taken. If your ancestor was a town or city dweller, many of the places already mentioned would still apply. Plot their birth, marriage, and death places, along with churches and hotels, and any routes regularly taken to these places. But now you can also look for any major source of employment, such as a factory or a coal mine, as well as a school or graveyard. Is there a river nearby where barges operated, or a rail line transporting produce from the countryside? Don't overlook a town's green or parkland. Recreation may have played a role in your ancestor's life. Maybe he was a member of the cricket team, which played once a month on a paddock kindly provided by a local farmer, or where the local church held their annual Sunday school picnic. But perhaps you were more interested in a smaller search for your ancestors' social network. Just finding a map of your ancestors' street and adding findings from census returns can give you an insight into their lives. Who were these people that your ancestor brushed shoulders with each day and what occupations did they follow? How many families lived in the street, and how many in each house? Did any of them employ a servant? And was there a family related to your ancestor living in the same street? What type of dwellings might your ancestor and his neighbours have lived in? Could it be a boarding house, a row of miners' cottages, terrace housing, or tenements? As an aside, why don't you map the street where you live today, noting street numbers and family names? Your descendants would thank you for this information somewhere in the future.
Putting flesh on your ancestors' bones and resuscitating their lives takes time and research, but by tracking down historical documents, discovering relevant social histories, and speculating on what your ancestors' lives may have been like, you turn sterile names, dates and places into a compelling historical family narrative.
We hope that you've enjoyed this insight into what's possible when we start to delve deeper into our ancestors' lives. In the concluding episode in this series, our hosts will pass on 10 top tips which might help you break down the inevitable brick wall and further your research. Be sure to join us again on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.